Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett and these are the top stories this hour. And in breaking news, London's police chief says officers are now investigating several parties that are claimed to have taken place at Prime Minister Boris Johnson's office and government departments during COVID lockdowns. Ukraine takes delivery of more US military aid after President Joe Biden says the West is united in warning Russia of grave consequences if it invades its pro-Western neighbour. The United Nations condemns a military takeover in Burkina Faso and calls for the immediate release of President Roch Kabore and other top officials. Eight people are killed and dozens more injured in a crush outside a football stadium at the Africa Cup of Nations in Cameroon. Nearly 24 sailors on an Australian military ship going to deliver aid to Tonga have tested positive for coronavirus, raising fears they could bring COVID-19 to a Pacific nation that has so far managed to avoid outbreaks. In Istanbul, Europe's busiest airport shuts down, grounding flights stretching from Africa to Europe and Asia. Flurries are forecast to continue over the next few days in Turkey's largest city. And we will begin with that breaking news that London police are now investigating claims of a series of potentially illegal parties in and around Downing Street over the last 2 years. That confirmation followed the latest reporting revolving around allegations the Prime Minister had a birthday party in Downing Street on the 19th of June 2020. Well, let's get straight into this with Giles Gibson, our London correspondent, who joins me now live. And Giles, tell us exactly what are the police saying, and do we know which alleged events they're looking into?
Well, Dame Cressida Dick, who is the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, she's been speaking to a committee in the Greater London Assembly in the last couple of hours, and she has said that this investigation is going to focus on a number of events that took place over the course of the last 2 years, both on Downing Street as well as in Whitehall. So the scope of this is not just looking at 10 Downing Street. Crucially, this is also looking at potential social gatherings that took place during periods of lockdown here in the UK in government departments as well. Ollie, there is no doubting that this marks a really major shift in this scandal for Boris Johnson and for 10 Downing Street, because, of course, in the past, we've had Sue Gray, this civil servant, investigating this. We've been waiting for her to file her report into multiple social gatherings, allegations that parties took place in 10 Downing Street over the course of lockdown periods here in the UK. But as a senior civil servant, she doesn't really have the power to hand out any punishments. She doesn't have the power to fire anybody in terms of Downing Street staff or even ministers and that kind of thing. Whereas, in contrast, the Metropolitan Police, of course, have the power to hand out criminal charges if they find evidence of clear wrongdoing, and they could also hand out fines as well. So the stakes here have just suddenly got even higher for Boris Johnson and his team inside 10 Downing Street.
Well, Giles, you were mentioning that report from the civil servant Sue Gray into all of this that we were expecting to be published this week. Are we still expecting that?
Well, we've heard from the Cabinet Office via a spokesperson saying that Sue Gray's investigation will continue despite this announcement from the Metropolitan Police. But they've also very importantly said that her report won't be published while the Metropolitan Police investigation is still ongoing. So we now have a scenario, Ollie, where we could be looking at weeks or even months to wait for Sue Gray to file her report into allegations of parties held at 10 Downing Street. In the meantime, we are still seeing calls for Boris Johnson to resign. Not surprisingly, the leader of the opposition, Labour Party, Keir Starmer, has once again called on Boris Johnson to step down in the wake of this latest story that was put out by ITV News here in the UK. And there are also more cracks starting to appear within the Conservative Party itself. We've heard from Baroness Varsi, who is a member of the House of Lords, and she's also formerly was chair of the Conservative Party. She said that Prime Minister Boris Johnson should think long and hard about what is in the best interests of the country.
Well, on that very note, Giles, what do you think this does for Boris Johnson's chances of surviving as leader and Prime Minister? Because a number of MPs in his Conservative Party, hadn't they, had been saying that they would be waiting for Sue Gray to report. Well, you seem to be saying that that won't be coming anytime soon.
Yeah, Ollie, that's the mantra, hasn't it, that we've been hearing over and over again, both from Prime Minister Boris Johnson and from senior members of his cabinet whenever they've been grilled on the radio or on television here in the UK about this ongoing scandal. They've been saying we have to wait for the Sue Gray investigation to wrap up, for the facts to be established, and then we can talk about next steps. But we now have this scenario, as I was just saying, that it could take weeks or even months for Sue Gray to finally file her report. So that defence, that line from 10 Downing Street and from senior Conservatives is not really going to work anymore, is not going to cut the mustard. Really, the question is now, what does this do to the thinking of Conservative MPs who were waiting for Sue Gray's investigation to wrap up, who were waiting for her report before they decided whether they're going to send a letter to the chair of the 1922 committee, Graham Brady, potentially calling for a no-confidence vote in Boris Johnson. There could perhaps be Conservative MPs who see this as creating a bit of breathing space, that the Metropolitan Police investigation will continue for weeks and months, and perhaps the heat will come off Boris Johnson and off 10 Downing Street. But there must also be Conservative MPs right now who are just really concerned that this scandal is going to rumble on for weeks and weeks and months, and who are now perhaps being pushed over the edge and potentially, as we speak, starting to write out a letter to Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 committee, calling for that vote of no confidence in the British Prime Minister.
OK, Giles, thank you. Giles Gibson reporting live from London on that breaking news that the Metropolitan Police are now investigating a series of claims of parties which may have breached lockdown regulations over the last 2 years here in the UK. Fears of a Russian invasion of Ukraine are growing by the day, and the diplomatic options are, if anything, reducing. But the West is trying to put up a united front to face the potential Russian aggression.
It's very clear that the Russians have no intention right now of de-escalating.
The Pentagon announced on Monday that it was putting 8,500 troops on heightened alert to be ready for possible deployment to Europe in the latest effort to reassure nervous NATO allies as Russia masses troops on the border with Ukraine.
There's been no mission assigned right now. This is about getting troops ready.
Pentagon spokesman John Kirby stressed that no decision has been made yet on whether to deploy the troops, and that they would fill the ranks of a NATO rapid response force should Russia invade Ukraine. So far, NATO has about 4,000 troops and multinational battalions in Eastern Europe.
We are considering to further enhance our presence in the eastern part of the alliance.
In a tweet, NATO's Secretary General said any further aggression by Russia against Ukraine will have severe costs, which he posted after an online meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden and the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Britain, and the European Union. Russia called the moves Western hysteria and denies planning an invasion. But having surrounded Ukraine with an estimated 100,000 troops from the north, east, and south, Moscow is now citing the Western response as evidence that Russia is the target, not the instigator of aggression. Meanwhile, Britain said it was withdrawing some staff and dependents from its embassy in Ukraine, a day after the U.S. said it was ordering diplomats' family members to leave the country.
Amid a rise in COVID-19 infections, many European countries have tightened virus restrictions. Some have taken steps targeting the unvaccinated, for example. But there are also others which are starting to lift anti-COVID restrictions. Let's take a look at some of the different approaches. The French government's introduced a vaccine pass, which will act as proof of vaccination. It'll be required to enter restaurants, bars, tourist sites and other public areas. The vaccine pass is different from the health pass, which was made mandatory last summer.
Moi, personnellement, ça me rassure, dans le sens où je sais à qui j'ai affaire. Et je considère ça rentre dans l'optimisation de la santé. On veut être dans un endroit où on est sûr au niveau santé. Et si on est sûr, si la personne vérifie les passes et que même qu'il vérifie l'identité, quelque part, c'est rassurant à plusieurs effets, quoi. C'est rassurant.
Meanwhile, Germany has extended its pandemic measures with a warning that the fast-spreading Omicron variant could bring critical infrastructure to a grinding halt. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has announced the latest curbs, which include limiting private gatherings to 10 people and requiring proof of booster vaccinations or negative tests at restaurants.
Diese Regelung haben dazu beigetragen, dass bei uns die hohen Infektionszahlen, die uns noch Ende letzten Jahres vorhergesagt worden sind, erst jetzt erreicht worden sind. Viel später als in vielen Nachbarländern. Trotzdem sind es sehr hohe Infektionszahlen und deshalb gilt für uns auch, dass wir unverändert vorsichtig bleiben müssen und diesen Kurs auch beibehalten werden. Darauf haben sich Bund und Länder in dieser Zusammenkunft miteinander verständigt.
Here in the United Kingdom, though, a different approach. The country is taking further steps towards normalcy. The British government is scrapping coronavirus testing requirements for fully vaccinated people arriving in England. And the government plans to move beyond restrictions and try and set out the path to live with the virus. The country's Transport Minister Grant Shapps has made the announcement. The change will take effect from the 11th of February.
Mr. Speaker, from 4 a.m. on the 11th of February and in time for the half-term break, eligible fully vaccinated passengers arriving in the UK will no longer have to take a post-arrival lateral flow test. That means that after months of pre-departure testing, post-arrival testing, self-isolation, additional expense, all that fully vaccinated people will now have to do when they travel to the UK is to verify their status via a passenger locator form.
Next to Burkina Faso, where soldiers have seized power. It's a takeover that follows a mutiny over the civilian president's failure to contain an Islamist insurgency. Burkina Faso's army has ousted President Roch Kabore, suspended the constitution, dissolved the government and announced the closure of the country's borders.
Celebrations erupted in Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, on Monday evening, after the army said it had ousted the president. That announcement on state television also said that Roch Kabore's government had been dissolved, the constitution suspended, and the West African country's borders closed. It was made in the name of a previously unheard-of entity, the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, and was said to have been signed by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo de Miba. The statement cited the deterioration of the security situation and what the army described as Kabore's inability to unite the country. It added that the takeover had been carried out without violence and that those detained were in a secure location. Kabore has not been seen since heavy gunfire erupted from several military camps on Sunday. On Monday morning, bullet-ridden armoured vehicles of the presidential fleet could be seen outside his residence. One was stained with blood. Kabore had faced waves of protests in recent months amid frustration over the killing of civilians and soldiers by militants linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Soldiers mutinying on Sunday were said to be demanding more support in their fight against the insurgents. As the sun set on Ouagadougou's Place de la Nation, President Mahamadou Ouedraogo claimed that most people support the military and were relieved that Kabore was no longer president. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, the African Union and West African bloc ECOWAS have all condemned the move by the military and urged it to ensure Kabore's safety.
To Cameroon now, where at least 8 people have been killed in a stampede outside an Africa Cup of Nations soccer game. It took place at Alembe Stadium in Cameroon's capital Yaoundé. Fans were trying to get in to watch the host country play Comoros during the last 16 knockout game in Africa's most prestigious tournament. The stadium was operating at 80% capacity due to COVID-19 restrictions. The continental soccer government body, CAF, has released a statement saying it's investigating the situation. Officials at a nearby hospital say they've received at least 40 injured people after the stampede. Many of them are said to be in a critical condition. A number of US states and the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., are suing Alphabet's Google over what they call deceptive location tracking practices that invade users' privacy.
Several US states sued Google on Monday over what they call deceptive practices in location tracking. Texas, Indiana, Washington State and the District of Columbia all accuse the tech giant of invading users' privacy. The bipartisan suit accuses Google of falsely leading customers to believe that changing their account and device settings would allow them to protect their privacy. But instead, the suit alleges, Google continues to systematically surveil its customers and profits from their data. Google has been quick to respond. Spokesperson Jose Castaneda said the case was based on inaccurate claims and outdated assertions. He added, quote, "We have always built privacy features into our products and provided robust controls for location data. We will vigorously defend ourselves and set the record straight." A similar case was filed against Google by the state of Arizona in 2020. It alleged the US firm used deceptive and unfair practices to obtain the location data of users. That lawsuit is pending.
For many decades, Bhutan lived in isolation from the rest of the world. Television, for example, came to Bhutan only in the 1990s. But once technology did penetrate the kingdom, there was no holding it back. Today, Bhutan is held up by many as a model society for technological integration. So how did it do it, and what's next?
They used to call this place the Hermit Kingdom. Perched high up in the Himalayas, walled off from the outside world. Bhutan is where you came to disconnect. Plus, it's not like you had any other option. Technology came late to this country. Telephones in 1963, print media in 1965, radio in 1973 and television in the 1990s. So if you travel to Bhutan, disconnecting was your only option. But you know what they say about late bloomers? Once they catch up, there's no stopping them. Case in point, Bhutan. The people here have completely embraced technology. The young monks still wear traditional clothes. But their hands are constantly scrolling through their smartphones. A lot of the credit goes to the Bhutanese king. In 2019, this was his warning to the people. If we are not able to embrace and leverage technology, we will be invariably left behind. The king commanded, his people followed. The Bhutanese government launched the digital Drukyul flagship program. It focuses on 3 aspects: public services, education and healthcare. The idea was to create a smart, inclusive society, and soon remote schools were connected by the internet. teachers gained access to digital content. In healthcare, all patient information was upgraded to digital files. One click, and doctors could access entire medical histories. But the most visible change was in television. By the end of this year, all cable TV connections will be digitized. 60 out of Bhutan's 90 cable operators are already on board. In September last year, the country announced their first digital currency, the digital Ngultrum. It is called paperless and sustainable. On point for the carbon-negative kingdom. Bhutan's journey is an example for smaller nations. You may be late to changes. You may have spent decades in the wilderness. But once the floodgates of progress open, catching up is not that hard. South Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
And finally, NASA's James Webb Space Telescope is designed to give the world a glimpse of infant galaxies from the early stages of the universe. The telescope has arrived at its gravitational parking spot in orbit around the Sun, nearly 1 million miles from Earth. We'll leave you with that story. Thanks for joining us as ever. I'm Ollie Barrett. We'll see you at the same time tomorrow on WION. Do stay tuned. World is One.
First year of JWST science observations has already been planned, and we will be looking at things in the universe ranging from objects within our own solar system all the way out to searching for the very first galaxies to be born after the Big Bang and everything in time and space in between. It's going to be awesome. We expect the first science images from JWST to come back in about 5 months. So be getting excited, getting ready for those to come back later on this summer. And we can expect really spectacularly beautiful images to come back from this awesome new telescope.
Additions, right? Arab?